Hi, welcome to Ladies Bible Class. It is October the 20th whenever we are publishing this video. I'm recording it a few days before, and we are continuing our study today on 1 Corinthians. Today we will study chapters 9 through 11. We are in chapter 4 of Melissa Spolstra's book, Living Love When We Disagree. And so if you have not had a chance to look at the first 3 lessons of this, if you've just stumbled across, or if you are just now getting to this study, then please go ahead and pause now, because that way you can see the first 3 chapters and study along up to this point. It does build from one to the next. I really do think it's a 6-week study, so it won't take too long to catch up. And I think that you will get more out of this if you take a minute to do that. If you have ordered a book from the church office and you need to come pick it up, just give us a call. Or if you would like to order a book, I found it on Amazon. It is by Melissa Spolstra. It's called Living Love When We Disagree, and it's pretty easy to find. So let's just do a real quick review, and then we'll get started today on where we are. So the story so far is that, number 1, love is the foundation of everything that we do. And number 2, that Christ is the foundation, where that foundation comes from. And I'm trying something new today. I'm trying to look at my computer instead of a piece of paper, so I don't look down so often. So if I seem a little awkward, it's because I kind of am. And so I'll get the rhythm of it here in just a second. And then the next thing that we talked about is, what does love look like in action, especially to outsiders? That's really what we looked at last week. And then this week, we are going to talk about, how do we work together in our spiritual practices and disciplines to prepare ourselves for loving work? Now, we are looking at this through the lens of 1 Corinthians and the church in Corinth. And today we are using chapters 9, 10, and 11. So before we go too off the rails and try to connect the dots here, because there will be a little bit of that's necessary, let's just focus real quick on what these chapters are about. So chapter 9, we're going to be talking about spiritual freedoms and rights, and then social norms. Chapter 10 is really talking about warning signs. This was all written by Paul, the Apostle Paul, in about 55 AD. And he reminds us of warning signs that are in the scriptures, that are in the histories of the Israelites, that we need to remember for ourselves. And then rights again. And then chapter 11, it gets real interesting. We're going to talk about head coverings and social norms, and how to have proper group meals and the Lord's Supper. So that's a lot to talk about. And again, we're going to pull it together into, how do we have our own spiritual practices together that help us to do loving work together. So, also, I want to touch a little bit about loving boundaries. This is something we don't talk a whole lot about. I feel like in a circle of women that we often have been raised to not have loving boundaries, because that's the polite thing to do. And so we're going to talk about that just a little bit today. Not a whole lot, but I do want to bring it up. So let's just review real quick again about last week, so that we can come full circle. So last week we talked about chapters 6 through 8, and Paul answered some very direct questions that were sent to him from the church in Corinth, and the answers are a little harsh. They are very direct, and they are to the point. But again, they are answering very direct questions. So he wanted to be clear. Now this week, we're going to go just a little bit deeper into social norms and customs of Corinth, and how the church is handling some of that coming into their worship service. And then Paul also answers some questions concerning his own authority and rights as an apostle. which is interesting. Obviously, there was a little bit of a heated discussion about that. So let's start in chapter 9. And I apologize, I don't have any fabulous readings this week from anybody. I really did enjoy that. I think it's nice to see each other, even virtually, being able to take turns reading. I did not have time to make phone calls and pull that off. I apologize. But I bet it'll come back before the end of our study. Somebody else will pick it up. So sorry about that. You're just going to get me today. We're going to start in chapter 9, verse 1. It says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to our food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who at any time pays the expenses for doing military service? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not get any of its milk?" So Paul has a point. And he goes on for a few more verses explaining why he has his rights and authority as an apostle to be supported by the church. Now, he does land in verse 15 to say that he has no use of these rights. And so he very plainly says that he does have the right to these things, yet he chooses not to use it. And his reasoning for that is that he doesn't want to do anything that would hinder the furthering the church. He tries to limit his support as much as possible. And he does say that even if he was a volunteer, if he was, full-time preaching, either way, this is something he's compelled to do. He has to do it. And this is what he's dedicated his life to full-time. And so it's okay for them to serve him a meal now and again. Now, obviously, I don't think we question this so much these days. It has become kind of the way that we do church and make it happen. It's not unusual in our society to look at something like this. It probably was a little bit more unusual to them, especially with the different cultures coming in. And so I think Paul's just trying to state his place. And obviously, this was a conversation that was a source of discord between the members, and it was something that people were questioning. They just didn't understand why are we doing this? Why doesn't he take care of himself? And so I think that's where that is coming from. But he does elaborate just a little bit and go on to something that I call Witnessing 101. Because while they are talking about, while Paul is talking about being supported in his rights as an apostle, he continues on with the work that he's doing, the work that he's, I think, hoping that everybody is going to be able to eventually do. So he gives a little talk about how to talk to other people, and that's why I call it Witnessing 101, because what he's really getting at is conducting yourself within the construct of social norms by being respectful to the traditions of others and allowing them to be comfortable enough to lend you an ear. Now, we are going to visit this same idea later on and talk again about those loving boundaries, because we can do that to a point. There's a place where you have to say, okay, I really want to hang with you guys, but as much as I want to be part of the group so that you'll listen to me, this has gone too far. And so we all have that place, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's read in chapter 9, verse 20. It says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might be by all means save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings. We're going to pick back up in verse 26 here in just a second. But I want to look at this because Paul is saying that whenever he is with people that have certain traditions, he adopts their traditions for those moments and partakes in that time with them so that, again, they are going to be comfortable with his presence to be able to lend him an ear. Now, in the Jewish community, that was probably a lot easier for him to do because he had that background. But he says, to the weak, I am weak. So, he's being relatable. I think that's what he's saying here. He's being relatable. He's meeting people where they are, not expecting them to adapt to where he is in order to listen to him so that he may talk to them and spread the gospel. Now, in verse 26, he does go on just a little bit to talk about how athletes train and how they train for races and how boxers train. And in verse 26, he says, so I do not run aimlessly, nor do I box as though beating the air. He's saying the athletes, they train for the race in order to win the race. The boxer trains for the fight in order to win the fight. So we, as the church, have to train as if we are to win the race. So if we are going to be speaking to other people outside of our normal social group, if we're going to be speaking to people that are outside of the culture in which we were raised or the traditions that we were raised in, we've got to get ourselves ready in order to do that and see it through. Or we're just running in circles. We're just shadow boxing. And we're not getting anything done. And so, again, I call that Witnessing 101. And we might come back to it here in just a little bit. There's a lot of good stuff there. So there's so much going on. I don't want to keep you as long as I did last time. And I'm on borrowed time, I feel. As you can see, I'm in my children's bedroom. And they're gonna barge in here at any minute. So I'm in chapter 10 now, and we're going to look at warnings from Israel's history. Paul uses these as reference points because they're commonly known stories, especially to not just the Jewish people. People knew other people's stories. The Gentiles knew the stories of the Israelites, just like I know stories about Hinduism. I'm not Hindu. So people know each other's stories. And so they can still be reference points. He's not just specifically talking to Jews that have converted into Christianity. But these are well-known stories, not just for us, but they are well known throughout all of history. So he gives these warnings about the acts of the Israelites during Moses's time. And he talks about the sexual immorality. He talks about the idol worship. He talks about how they just conduct themselves with gluttony. And he refers to the incident where they get all bitten by a bunch of snakes. And there's that act of faith that has to be shown in order for them to be saved. And Moses comes in with the bronze snake. It's always a really interesting Bible class to teach to children because they pick up on the symbolism just like that. They might not get the reason why people are being bitten by snakes. That goes right over their heads because that's a painful thing and they don't get that and they don't need to get that. But they pick up on the symbolism of the pole that resembles the cross and of the bronze snake and putting your faith in, believing what you don't see. And they totally get that. And so he refers to all of this as a way to remind them of the pitfalls. This also reminds us, we still use these stories. We still teach these stories. We read these stories all the time. And we refer to them all the time because they are markers. They are historical markers to remind us of the ways that your basic human can fall. And so he's reminding them of these things just to kind of keep them on their toes, right? It's not an accusation, it's a warning. Be careful. Be careful and don't fall into these temptations. And I really like verse 13 that says, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." I really like that. I think that that is very clear. Number one, you aren't being tempted by anything any more than anyone else ever has. Number two, God's not going to allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear. That can be really hard to feel in the moment. And we have to remember that He knows us better than we know ourselves. And so we can handle it. We just don't think we can. And I love this part that, but when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. There's always a way out. I think that's key for us to remember, that whenever temptations happen, there's a way out. We just have to be willing to see it. And I think that's something that we all need to always carry around with us, because none of us are immune to temptations. That's what being a human is. And so I just really wanted to point that out. Now, we are going to talk again about the idol feast. Yes, we're talking about the sacrificing the food to the idols again. And I know that this is so beyond our everyday, but it was a really big deal. And it talks about a relationship concept that is very important and does mean a lot to us today. So let's take a look at it, okay? So the subject of eating the idol's meat is back, and Paul clarifies his reasoning for behind the Lord's Supper as well at the same time as this, because things are happening all jumbled together. And so he defines the eating the meat to the idols. He defines the Lord's Supper, and then ends with, you can't do both. You can't sacrifice to idols and partake in that culture and say that you're part of that belief system and then also partake in the Lord's Supper. You can't do both. You've got to choose a lane. I think this is, again, another definition of the loving boundaries, because as we're going to read here in just a minute, there is a time and a place to sit down and be a part of a meal with people. Maybe some of that meat was sacrificed to the idol, and then now it's being eaten for dinner. So sometimes you should just go with the flow, even though your gut's kind of like, I'm not so sure, so that you can partake in getting to know these people. Then there are times where you cut it off and you say, nope, I can't do that. And there's a good reason for it, and we're going to talk about it in just a second. Especially if you are taking the Lord's Supper. Essentially, you've got to pick a lane. You can't be both. You've got to choose one. You got to hone in on it. So we're going to talk about, and I feel like I'm talking in circles a little bit, because I feel like Paul is writing in circles just a little bit. And so I'm trying to get with the program here. Verse 23. Let's read together. I have the right to do anything. There it is again. There's our special word, rights. Let's start again. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But If someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I'm referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? So whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even if it is to please everyone in every way. Even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Okay, so there was a lot going on in this verse. Number one, here's where I'm saying sometimes it's okay to go ahead and sit down and have the meal. Get to know everybody, even though it's not your lane. Go ahead and jump in. It says, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. If you are invited and there's not this long laundry list of things that might offend you or that you think are wrong, you're just invited, then go ahead. Okay? Use a judgment call. Go ahead. But if they say to you that this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it. So then, okay, but things change. Once you get more information, things change now. Now you've got to say, hold on a second. I can't do that. And it's not about your conscience. It's for the sake of theirs. Again, we're talking about the stumbling blocks. Now you have been clearly informed of the situation. So if you partake in something that you have just recently told other people not to do, you're going to look like a hypocrite. So you can be invited. You can go and get to know people and doing something differently. But if you get information that is clearly saying to do something that you have told people not to do, then you're going to have to stick to your word, and you're going to have to say, no, I can't do that. That goes against what I have told people, or whatever you want to say. But you can't do it. Paul said, we're not going to do that. Now, as we go on, again, we're picking up this idea of why are my freedoms being judged by another's conscience? Why? Because it's not about you. Because it's not about them either. Because we are doing this for the glory of God. Plain and simple. And again, we're going to pick up these boundaries. So I like this. Even as I tried to please everyone in every way. So Paul's trying to be a Jew for the Jews, weak for the weak. He's going to the dinner. He's making judgment calls. He's trying to be around all these different kinds of people all the time. He's trying to be everything for everybody. You can't. You can't do that. It's just not possible. I'm guilty of that. I think all of you know that's true. You've seen me do it. I've seen you do it. We're guilty of this. We do this. We try so hard to do all these things for all these people, and we don't put boundaries on it. It starts to become about me. It becomes about you. It becomes about them, and it becomes about them. And we're losing the point. We're spinning in the circles, and we're shadow boxing, and we're not getting anything done, because that's not glorifying God. That's just being busy, even with a good thing. And I think as women, we definitely fall into this trap. Our society has set us up. We have been raised by other women that you are polite. You put yourself last. You do all of these things, and at the heart of it, you're just trying to help somebody. It doesn't sound like the wrong choice. But it turns it all into an us and a me and a we and all these other things, all these personal words, when it's not about us. And whenever we make it about God, then the possibilities change. The possibilities change, and you realize that this is about God. This is about the love of Christ. So even if I don't do this fabulous project could go on without me, because it's not about me. Somebody else can do it this time. It's really hard. I think it's really hard. I think it's one of the hardest lessons that I'll ever have to learn. And I dare to say some of you as well. So let's move on. How are we doing on time here? I don't know. I made the screen look different. I have no idea. We're just going to keep going then. So we are now going to go into chapter 11. It is not as complicated as it sounds. When you first read it, you're thinking, what are we talking about? What is this? We're talking about our hair and our heads and scarves? What are we talking about, scarves? It's not that complicated. It's actually simple and deep at the same time, like clear, deep water. Okay, so let's take a look. So, number 1, chapter 11, head coverings during worship. Let's not take it out of context. Okay, that's making it too hard. Let's look and see what the context is here. So at this time in Corinth, the social implications of hairstyle were taken very seriously. So there was, this letter was written about 55 AD by Paul. We already talked about that. And for about 250 years, there is this really big cult that there's many cults, but there was one that was, it made the newspapers, right? So it's interwoven into all different little parts of society, and it's the cult of Dionysus. So it's in the political system, it's in there every day, it's in the market, it's in what educational system there was, probably only for boys. And I don't mean that sarcastically. I mean, it probably was. And it's all written in here. Everywhere you go, and it's kind of a secret, but everybody knows, right? And sexual immorality in this cult was normal behind closed doors, and all different kinds of sexual acts were going on. So that being said, men often wore their hair very long and would do their hair up like women to show out in society that they were available for this cult. Okay, so I think you can put 2 and 2 together there. Now, women often did a lot of the praying and the prophesying within the worship services of the cult, okay, the spiritual practices of the cult, and they would wear their hair down, and they were probably naked. I don't know, I wasn't there, but they were probably naked. I've seen paintings, and they're, it's kind of like crazy. I'm sure you can imagine it. I mean that, they're kind of all over the place, and their hair's all over the place and all this. So knowing that this is interwoven into the spiritual practices of this underground cult that is all over the place and has been for a couple hundred years, right? Okay, it's established in this community. Then Paul is trying to, there's some kind of question, I'm sure, as people are coming in with these different cultural experiences, these different spiritual experiences, and these other religions. They're coming in with a set of expectations of what a spiritual service is, right? They're coming in with expectations of how people act and how people behave. And we all know that the word holy means to be set apart. And so from the very beginning, especially with the Israelite people, God is always trying to say, let's act differently. We're going to be a counterculture. We're going to be set apart, not out of self-righteousness, not because we're better, but because we're going to do something different. Okay, so that is where I really feel that the context of this is coming from. I think this is where Paul is coming from here. And whenever you look at this within that context, it makes sense. And it also does not contradict other instructions that other churches were giving for the circumstances in their culture, right? So, number one, Paul looks at their old traditions that they've brought in, and he starts off with a little encouragement. So let's start in verse 2, and I'm going to read a little something and then let's break it down. It says in verse 2, I praise you for remembering me and everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, the head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. We're going to stop there. So, number one, again, let's look at what the head of means. I feel like it has been taken out of context and it has been mistranslated and interpreted in this particular passage to mean of an authority. While yes, that is true to a certain degree, especially with the hierarchy. You know, we've got this hierarchy here where we've got God and we've got man, or we've got God and Jesus, and then we're breaking down into humanity. So, yes, there is a hierarchy, but in the original Greek, this word that was used for in the head of is also the same word used for a source. Okay, so it does have authority because of the origin of how creation goes. But we're talking more about the hierarchy of creation, not the social authority. Okay, does that make sense? And so in creation, we've got God, okay, we've got Jesus, and then we've got man and woman. And man is the source of woman because Eve was taken from Adam's rib. But Paul goes on to say that the woman bears children, and those are men that have, you know, other children. And so at this point, after we've broken down into man and woman, we're just repopulating and we're just humanity, right? And so we're talking about the source, like the source of a river, the head of a river. Okay, so the beginning of a thing. And whenever we look at it this way, Paul is actually saying something a little radical for his time, and we will get into that. And you know, I sometimes give him a hard time for some of the subordinate speech that comes around in speaking of women. But I will back up a minute and change my story on this one, because he's really saying something that is very progressive for the time that he's in, and rather radical, and really stepped out on a limb for women in this passage. So we're going to look at verse 7. It says, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, and everything comes from God. So yeah, it gets a little wordy, okay? But again, Paul is laying out the creative order of things. But in verse 10, he says it's for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Now, the because of the angels part, it's a little bit of a cliffhanger. I think that we can go way out into the stratosphere talking about prophecy and how angels deliver messages, and we certainly can. But that's not our point today. I'd love to look at that maybe further another time. But if you have thoughts, email me, because I'd love to talk about it. We just don't really have time here. But what I really want to focus on, it's for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head. a woman to have authority over her own anything during 55 AD was incredibly progressive and radical and unheard of. Women were good for making babies, having a good time, and cleaning up messes. They were property. And I don't like it, but that's the reality. And so Paul's saying that a woman should be able to do what she wants with her head, like, quit, let's leave her alone. Now he does kind of break it down and get very specific. He gives a lot of different scenarios and then kind of specifically answers the question. So he does finish to say that men should keep their hair short. Okay, now when we think about the cultural references of a man with long hair in Corinth during this time, it kind of makes sense. Okay, he's saying, let's just make sure that people understand that you're not here to practice those types of spiritual practices. You're here to worship God. And so, let's do this. It makes sense. Also, he tells women that they should cover their hair. And I think it's, does that mean that we're all wrong for not wearing a scarf? No. I think it just means, tidying up and just having yourself together and not loose and free and flowing and twigs and who knows what going on and naked and all kinds of other crazy stuff that's going on in these other religions around the city. Okay. But again, he's putting it up to women to make their own choices about their hair, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but believe me, it was. So, let's see. Now, then we're going to talk just a little bit about the Lord's Supper. So he brings up the Lord's Supper again at the end of this chapter, and this is what we're going to end with today as far as our scripture is concerned. And Paul is bringing this up because there was a thing happening, right, where they were getting together to take the Lord's Supper, and then they started having these big meals and they started having feast. Well, if you didn't have any food to bring, then you didn't have anything to eat. And so you have people that are like having these massive Thanksgiving style meals, and then you've got people that are hungry over here, and they were there to take the Lord's Supper. That's totally missing the point. I mean, beyond missing the point of the whole thing. And so he advises them, have your big meal at your house and just come and take the Lord's Supper. You can't, you can't leave people out of things. And it was becoming a problem. And so I think that he just brings it up and is very, very clear about what the Lord's Supper is for, because he just wants to put a stop to that. And he does say in verse 22, he says, don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? That's pretty to the point. I don't think you can read into that. That's pretty clear. And, he also, again, goes into the idea of examining yourself before you take the Lord's Supper so that you don't drink judgment upon yourself. And this is one of those instances where this makes sense. That doesn't always make sense in a big universal idea, because if I'm trying to come in perfect, it makes grace sound useless, right? If I'm coming into the Lord's Supper perfect, what do I need it for? And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about if you see somebody that is hungry and you just knock down a big turkey with your family and then you offer them the bread and the wine and talk about the body of Christ, that's making no sense. So he's just shutting that down completely. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. And let's pull this together for ourselves. Okay, how do we, because we were talking about their spiritual practices, right? That's what we were discussing in 9, 10, and 11 is whenever they come together. We've talked about how love is the base of what we do. We've talked about where love comes from. We've talked about what love looks like in action and what it doesn't look like out in the world. So now we're talking about how do we train, how do we work together so that we are doing the things necessary as a group to be able to go out and do these things together without all of these weird little miscommunications, misunderstandings, little quibbly arguments, right? So number one, always, always, always number one, that it's not about you. And I know we all love that Rick Warren book, but it makes a lot of sense. Because it's not. It's just not. It's the easiest thing in the world to remember. It's what? 1, 2, 4 words. Well, 4.5, because we have a contraction. It's not about you, and it's not about me. So that takes a lot of the problems off of the table right there. The second thing that I noticed in these passages, and I'm kind of seeing the last few weeks all together because I put them together. So hopefully I'm not going overboard. But congregational disagreements, from what I can tell my own experience and from what I can see in these passages, is that they are typically rooted in each person trying to salvage their rights versus the other person's rights. It's not about you. It's not about me. And again, I love this phrase, relationships rather than rights. That's our focus. And I would like to elevate that thought into another person's conscience rather than my own rights. I don't want to do, and I know at the heart of things, I mean, I know most of y'all pretty well. I think you know me. I do not want to ever do something that's going to send somebody home in anxiety-ridden, sleepless nights, because I led them to that. Now, because we live in these blinders, we might do that unaware. And so being aware of our actions is crucial. Paying attention to what we do with other people and how we behave and what we say is really important. It doesn't mean we have to be neurotic. It just means we have to pay attention. Just paying attention. That usually is all it takes. So I have a couple of questions before we go, just to think about this week as you go about your week. What out of this resonates with you? What are some of these scenarios that you found yourself in? I'd love for you to think about them. And I know that there's a place to journal it in our workbook, because that is one rockin' workbook. It was like 30 pages for chapter 4. If you didn't get it all done, I had no time. I didn't get it all done either. And I said I was really going to try. I did try. I fell short. I dare to say that's probably yes and no. Some of it does resonate with us, and maybe some of it doesn't. I think that the women's issues definitely resonate with us. I think that the idea of the work that we need to do together as a group resonates with us. I know that's a stretch with the talking about the feast and the meals and the meat and all that stuff, but there's a metaphor there, and I bet you can find it if you think about it for just a minute. Now, here are a couple of things that I thought about while I was looking at this, because again, it is a stretch to see all of this when we talk about idols and hair coverings. But have we not fussed at each other for a lot less? Grumblings in the background. Of course we have, because that's what humans do. Okay? Again, nobody's tempted beyond anything that anybody's ever been tempted. We're not any different than any other church. So A couple of the things that I thought of were worship music styles. That one's always on the table. Some of us like traditional, some of us like contemporary. That's always one of those things. Can't ever get everybody together on that. Another one, do we have to invite everybody, or can it just be my group? I think that's a major possibility. That's a trap that we have fallen into sometimes. What about, every time that she gets up there to pray or do an announcement, her dress is so short? Okay, talking about how people look whenever they get up in front of us. Why can't the preacher just wear a tie? I mean, doesn't he want to look nice? These are all little things, little petty things that at the end of the day don't have anything to do with loving work and glorifying God. They're personal preferences. And I think that's really hard for us to let go of and see sometimes. So I would just like for us to leave this study this week with 9:26 from 1 Corinthians in our hearts. Okay. So I do not run aimlessly, nor do I box as though beating the air. I would love to commit with you not to running in circles and not to be boxing the air, doing nothing, getting nothing done. Let's get some work done. We can do this. Before we leave, let's have a quick prayer. I was thrown off by being in my girls' room. I went out of order. And then I'll see you next week. Okay. Dear Lord, thank you very much for this day. Thank you that we had this time together. I pray that you will help us to carry these words in our hearts, that you always give us opportunities to get out of temptations, that you want us to work intentionally and towards the goal, and that everything that we do is about you and you alone. Thank you for this time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you again so much for being with me. And next week, McKenna's going to be here, and she's going to be talking about spiritual gifts. So that should be really interesting. That's a great study. I love talking about those. It's really, really interesting. So we will see you next time. If you need anything at all, just give us a call.